It's scuffed o'clock, so let's talk about this week in fashion school. Submission day in textiles, so here's what I put in. I actually spent a lot of time in class doing this submission because I hadn't printed it at home and my printer was hecking up, and then using the school computers in the morning, they weren't working right, so yeah, so we ended up submitting three of the five tasks for this semester. So documenting the processes that we did in class, so you know, the dyeing, the bleaching, the screen printing. I'm trying to make all the layouts look really nice. And then I did put the actual samples in here as well. The embroidery that we did. And then we had to research some additional techniques. So I researched rusting, which I'm really interested in using on my process because it, you know, you can get some really funky sort of textures and colors, and rust is interesting because it essentially it stains. So it's a method of dyeing where the actual rust oxide stains the fabric and you can set it in place. So that's fabric printed on with some number plates, which is cool. I then researched boro technique. So this is a patchworking style that originates in Japan. It has a big focus on mending and increasing the longevity and the story and the life of a garment. In particular, uses sashiko stitching, so these really geometric straight stitching patterns. So all of that white there, that's all stitching, the patchwork. So I thought patchwork would be nice to put on my garment, so we might include that. And then, of course, because I'm a simp for technology, 3D printing and how that can be used. Because often you see like entirely 3D printed garments, but they're like really bony and structured, and they don't flow like garments do. So, you know, you can embellish with 3D printing. So this dress has 3D printed letters on the back, which are the buttons, and this overlay as well. These are some 3D printed buttons here, and these are some 3D printed textiles that I did myself on my printer I have downstairs. I wasn't sure if we were supposed to include this page in the assignment. I think the assignment document was old because it told us to research this international standard on textiles and its scope and how many countries are involved in it, and it doesn't, Australia isn't part of this. Like, it doesn't even have its own standard on this. Like, the Australian standards for fashion stuff kind of expired a few years ago, and it just hasn't been updated since, so I don't know if that's any useful information. Yeah. Oh yeah, here's my 3D print textiles. So these are not glued on. These are 3D printed through the fabric. So you print a few layers, then you tape down or peg down the fabric, and then keep printing. You can sort of see it's wedged between the layers there. Because it's netting, it goes through really easily. But I also burnt it in a couple places, like here, the melting temperature of the filament was the same as the fabric, so I have to try it on different textiles. So I tried it on this organza. It's not as flexible, but it's interesting. A way to reinforce garments, maybe. And it's not too uncomfortable on the inside, but it definitely could be improved with a lining. A mood board. I did this in class. So my mood board, Mad Max, that's what I want to do, Mad Max. And then I did up the design and the plan of action in class as well. So here are some concept developments. You know, we're going very wastelandish. And this is what the design should be at the end. It's probably going to end up being ugly. We'll see. And my plan of action. So those are the garments I have to work with. And my plan for how I'm gonna heck them the fuck up.
Hello. Before we go to bed, we need to learn you a thing about some more fashion history. we're moving into the 70s to the 90s here, and at this point, fashion is getting so widely interconnected and diversified and deep in variation that it's almost impossible to go over the entire thing, even if we're just looking at Western fashion. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of things, which is going to be the thematic idea of subcultures emerging throughout the 70s and 90s. It's something that came in before then, but really diversified and developed during this time period. Fashion here it's globalized, and while you probably will notice that like some of these subcultures that I'll mention do exist today, they exist in a different way or are influenced by different things than what they used to be. I guess I should probably say what a subculture even is. It's counterculture, it's anti-fashion, so it's a movement or collective or identified community, either self or throughout, that comes up around a core idea or a core set of aesthetics. So some obvious ones during this time period are going to be punk is a massive one. So punk was sort of in the 60s, but emerged mainly in the mid 1970s, and it's an anti-government sort of thing. It was like a youth culture movement. Young people didn't have many opportunities at the time, and it was kind of like we're rejecting your expectations of what we meant to be as adults, and we're going to create our own culture here. So punk, the obvious things are going to be the very dressed down, ripped, damaged intentionally or through wear and tear clothing. The safety pins, the metallic military utilitarian add-ons. It was a fashion that you could DIY it very easily, so it definitely appealed to this sort of middle-income socioeconomic group. And they kind of all rallied around this aesthetic. In addition, they also rallied around music, and you'll see quite clearly with all of these subcultures, music is a very core theme, either influencing the fashion or the community influencing the music. It's all interconnected. It's all part of culture. Run DMC would be one there. A hip hop group in the 80s and 90s, and hip hop ended up having its own set of aesthetic values. You can probably identify the really obvious ones of, the chains, oversized athletic leisure wear, heavy branding on prints and things like that. Conveying a sense of self-attained wealth while acknowledging the lower socioeconomic opportunities afforded by ethnic backgrounds. So this was a black culture movement. And to be fair, a lot of subcultures emerged from minorities, to be honest. Racial minorities, gender and sexuality minorities, refugees, people who are otherwise, the whole point of it is that it's not the mainstream, So you'll see, I'll just move over here a little bit, get out of the way of this picture of Elton John behind me. A lot of subcultures will often subvert gender expectations. For some of these styles, grunge and glam are good ones, there's less of a distinction between menswear and women's wear. We're rejecting the expectations of mainstream fashion, and we're exploring these gender diverse spaces. And this is primarily because queer people are who's in these subculture communities. And they're a force for these change, which is funny when these styles kind of go mainstream, right? Because these styles are created by people who are like, hey, you reject us, so we'll reject you and make our own thing. And then the mainstream's like, hey, give me that. we're gonna take that. So it's interesting to see how it gets co-opted and absorbed and then disconnected from its counterculture roots. Punk is a big one I complain about personally with how it gets detached from its counterculture roots. If I tell you about the aesthetic of cyberpunk, like everybody knows the aesthetic of cyberpunk, but do you know the meaning of cyberpunk and what it actually means to be punk? So when you get given something that's cyberpunk and aesthetic, but losing all the punk in its meaning and its counterculture and its anti-establishmentarianism and anti-capitalism, it's like, you ain't got punk, man. You just got neon lights. Also, more stuff. So, music, like I said before, massively influential. Grunge, punk, and hip hop are both genres of fashion and genres of music, and many musicians can be attributed to some more niche styles, like, gothic punk rock is definitely a thing. During the 70s to 90s, we had a massive explosion in resources and particular synthetics, moving on from the 60s, the synthetic boom. So it's even cheaper than ever. And people were experimenting with these textiles, bright polyesters, sequins, pleather, all sorts of decorations in that one. So over here, Diana Ross of the Supremes, very glamorous here, in her disco glam attire. It's all tied to going out and the nightlife and social activities and leisure activities there. I also wanted to add in a little point as well for culture that, we talk a lot about music and Hollywood and everything being an influence on fashion, but literature as well can have an influence on fashion. This comes in particularly when you have revivalism. So if we say the Gothic revivalism sort of thing, Gothic horror, Gothic Lolita, all that kind of draws from historical cultural references and contemporary literary media at the time as well. Of course, the other side of things is silhouettes and how they changed during these decades. So again, a lot of diversity in fashion during these time periods. So if we're talking about these things, we're just talking about a small window into it, but some stereotypical 70s things. Everybody knows flares. So the 70s saw a much wider variety of hemlines compared to previous decades. We were exploring like the maxi mini in the 60s. In the 70s, we have all sorts of hemlines. There's no standard expectation, both for men and for women here. Separates and trousers, shown over here, much more common for women than they used to be. But you can see a consistency here with like the A-line silhouette, and as we mentioned before, a experimentation investigation to synthetics and what they can do for you. Moving to the 80s, and the 80s are interesting for having both economic booms and economic downturns, and you see shifts in fashion during this time period as well. Obviously, as the subcultures before mentioned, it's going to vary our silhouettes, but some stereotypical silhouettes from the 80s would be these wide shoulders, power shoulders with the shoulder pads and everything in them, a cinched waist, very strong structured lines, this trapeze sort of shape, and that's called power dressing. So that kind of came in with I think it's either the second or the third wave of feminism. Yeah, something like that. So it was women taking power in the workplace, a very self-commanded movement, and co-opting these masculine structures with a feminine flair to them as a self-empowerment thing. In contrast to this, during economic downturns, we see more of a shift to more subdued looks, a rejection of the power dressing flamboyance and such. And then also we see in the 80s a obsession over, different decades have different influences for like who influences fashion. We've had Hollywood, we've had royalty, we've had magazines, we've had the ballet and things. 80s, Miss Princess Diana, massively influential. Whatever she wore, people wanted to wear. I don't know. It's an interesting thing, like the obsession, because it's before my time. I think I was very young when the sort of Princess Diana thing kind of fell. I even remember in primary school, teachers and adults talking about it. But yeah, even here you can see the oversized silhouette here is still common. Moving into the 90s, again, diversified even further, but you know, there are some tropes that people remember from the 90s. You know, casualization was massive in the 90s as well. Simpler lines, thrifting much more common, and we're borrowing our historical silhouettes. So obviously, as time goes on, we have more historical reference to go on for fashion and more things we can rework and be inspired by. This look, this spaghetti strap, slim fit sort of look. Now, I saw that everywhere in kids' magazines and things, was this spaghetti strap ass looking thing. But the 90s also was for grunge, massively influential there. So you're looking more at like distressed and oversized garments. So it's kind of a contrast here. More of like a natural kind of look there, a dressed down kind of look. Again, as a follow on from economic shifts. It's interesting to see how that affects fashion as well. I'm actually going to put in the description some channels you should check out if you would like more information on this, because I'm learning all of this like the teacher tells us, and then we research it, and then I write it down, and then I explain it, so it just kind of gets filtered through there. But you should hear from people that are much more expertise on these kind of topics, so I will include their expertise in the description. But otherwise, yeah, that's your fashion history lesson.
In the CAD class, we are finally moving on from Illustrator, as much as I like it, to Photoshop. Very similar. It is Adobe, heck Adobe, but it's more for like creating imagery, if that makes sense. So you know, photo manipulation, image manipulation, rather than the drawing aspect that Illustrator has. So we just kind of went over like various controls in the software, ways to insert and manipulate images, create patterns and stuff like that. So because we're gonna use Photoshop to make a mood board, essentially. And mine are very ugly. Look at these bitches. I mean, the art is really cool. It's actually our teacher drew it, but yeah, just kind of manipulating them using filters and things. I've used Photoshop before, so I kind of know what I'm doing in that regard. This is supposed to be a mood board, or it's a partly completed mood board. I think we're finishing it next week. But we had to find some Creative Commons images. There's not a lot of that for fashion, but I found a couple things, and we're just supposed to do some LiQWYD form. And yeah, there's some buildings, some architecture, some fashion, some photography, so it'll turn into something. We'll see how it goes next week, but right now, it's heckin' ugly. Finished pattern making class, so finished school for the week, which is exciting because all I can think about is the fact that there's a convention this weekend. It's Supernova, so presuming I upload this in time tonight, come check it out this weekend at the convention center in Brisbane. I will be tabling, actually, helping out at my mother's table, which is Lady Brass, table number 80 in the Artist Alley. She sells like cool steampunk accessories, like garnishes, as she calls them. So like, if you like steampunk stuff or want to come say hi, come have a look. Pattern making. We did like a practice for our exam next week. Yes, we have an exam next week. I need to remember that. Which will be interesting because until now we haven't really done anything that is like self-directed. We've always been handheld through all the processes, so we'll be given an image next week of a garment. I need to use our patterns and blocks to make a new pattern for it. You know, analyze the design, and that'll be interesting. See how that goes. Today was just a variation on the blast that we did last week. It's like, here's a new picture. Can you analyze the difference and use the same techniques? Which wasn't too bad. Sewing yesterday was what sucked. Just the whole day, the frustration levels in the room were very strong. Didn't start sewing until like an hour after class started. Just the pacing was really slow, and like we did the practice run last week, but the teacher wouldn't let us just do it today. She wanted to check every single step, and there was a lot of issues with our patterns because like the process we did to do them in a pattern making class was different than how the sewing teacher wanted. So there was like a lack of communication there, and also a lack of notation on our part. Like that's kind of, you know, if we did the pattern wrong, then you're going to cut it fabric wrong, then you're going to sew it wrong. So my collar is on backwards, but I still think it looks alright. So I didn't get a huge amount done. Could have had the whole shirt done in one go if I actually just sat down and did it. You know, and I tried to look at the sample and be like, oh, what's the next step? I can reverse engineer the sample, and I reverse engineered it wrong. So I should have just been patient and waited for guidance, but hubris. Anyway, that has been my week. I feel like it's just been so busy lately with all the assignments and the con and everything that I do not remember anything else. I'm sure something's happened and I've just forgotten about it. Otherwise, that's all my updates for this week. Only a couple more weeks left of the semester. And yeah, maybe we'll see you at the con.